Welcome to another episode of Finding Health and Happiness through doing art. We all deserve and cherish our health and happiness, and you deserve it too. I found it with doing art years and years ago. It's relaxing. So let's get on with it. And today's episode will move you one step closer to actually doing some painting. Previous episodes have focused on how to get started picking the right pastels, so check those out if you haven't done so already. But this episode takes you one step further by what is the right paper to use to paint with pastels. Okay? So you're not going to like the answer. I'm sorry. I have to give you that answer that everybody hates. And that answer is, it depends. Every artist starts with different papers. Every artist has to find what papers work for them. And the reason for that is there's different painting techniques. There's different ways that every artist begins painting. There's different ways that a lot of my paintings never start the same way twice. So the paper becomes something you have to experiment. And the more you experiment when you begin, the better off you are. Now I'm going to give you recommendations because there's nothing worse than me do a video and it's like, I don't know anything more than when I started this thing. So let me give you some recommendations. I recommend that beginners use just regular drawing paper. Now it doesn't have what we call a lot of tooth, and when I do the demo you'll see how different papers with different tooths behave. The more tooth you have, the more you can paint without brushing some of the pastel off and applying more pastel. At some point, every paper, every surface will have so much pastel filling all the nooks and crannies on its surface that when you mark on it, it no longer takes up any more pastel. So that's one of the beginning things that you have to figure out is how hard, how often, how many marks can I make on this paper before I have to do something to make it take more paper, or sorry, more pastel. So let's answer some of those questions as we go. And the second paper I recommend, and I'll demo a version of it, a professional artist version of it, is sanded, or sanded paper is what the artists call it. But I recommend for beginners just to go to the hardware store and get a sheet of 8 by 10 or 8.5 by 11 sandpaper and grit 400, 600, 800. Those are all good pastel papers or good sandpapers to use to get started in pastel. Now you think, sandpaper? Well, won't that grind down my pastel? Well, it will. But the key is that that sandpaper has enough grit and tooth that if you don't just press real hard, you'll be able to put different layers on without having to do some of the steps we'll talk about later to get other papers that fill up faster to take more pastel. That's the key. You have to figure out what's right for the techniques that you use and the techniques you develop. So no more blah, 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 blah. Let's get started. I'm going to demo those papers now. I'm going to use 2 or 3 of these pastel colors. I've got kind of a red-orange, a marigold yellow, and it looks like it might be crossed between a cobalt blue and cerulean blue. So I'll use these, and the first paper I have up here is what we call an enamel paper. Now, can you see the gloss on it? This is kind of the paper that printers use. This enamel paper has a very, very slick surface, and you have to have tooth to make pastel stick. So if you found some blank paper, I was given a stack of this stuff, which I used not for pastel, because here's what happens. Look at that. That's the red on there. Now I'm going to try to cover it with this marigold. Can you see it just does not stick to this enamel paper much at all. Matter of fact, watch this. it just comes right off. So enamel paper will not work. There are some slick papers that just don't work well, and enamel is one of them. I pulled out some pen and ink paper. My grandson uses pen and ink and markers, this kind of paper. A lot of people will have, so that pen and ink paper. Oh, look at that. That has, and I'll go as light as I can, and you can see some of that tooth. You see some of those skips? It has a tooth. But let's fill this up. And when I was talking about how the tooth will fill up, I'll put some marigold over the top of it. Now, I don't know if you could see it, but there's a lot of dust falling down on that. That tells me that it's starting to get full. But you can put a lot of marks on that paper. So if you've got some of that stuff laying around because you've been into pen and ink, it will work. But it will fill up fairly quickly because it doesn't have a lot of tooth. The next paper I pulled out of the drawer is for block printing. I bought a bunch of this and still have some left. It's a Strathmore Bristol, sorry. It is a heavyweight paper. It's about 100 pound, or for you folks that use grams, it's 270. This is very smooth to the touch too. And as you can see, it's very similar to the pen and ink. It's got enough tooth to pick things up. But if I keep going here, I can only put so many coats over it, and it will then start to degrade and fill up. A little closer look so you can see as I mark here, you can see all these little white spaces. Well, as I start marking and it starts to fill up, those white spaces are disappearing when I try to put this over the top of some of those areas. So that paper will take a few layers of pastel, but when you start layering 3 or 4 layers, it may be too smooth for some of the works that some of you want to do. Unfortunately, I grabbed a drawing pad that is tiny and didn't fit up here, so I'll hold it. Drawing pads are great to start with. That's a very light touch. I cover that all very easily. I very lightly can mix in my marigold, and I get kind of a dull orange because blue and orange are opposite of one another. So I create kind of a gray. You can see I can get that done just by mixing that. And you can blend it with your fingers. You could use other tools to blend with. So drawing paper, like I say, I start my beginners out with drawing paper, and this is a great way to get started inexpensively with pastels. Oh, and I forgot to add the red. There, we'll create a blue violet. Or a red violet. There's a red violet. Now we create a blue violet. Remember our mixing video from previous episodes? Go see that if you want to see more about pastel mixing. Okay, the next paper in line isn't really a paper at all. This is a piece of illustration board that I apparently cut out the center. When you look at this illustration board, you probably can't see it on the camera, but at least you don't see that shine that we had with the enamel paper. So it has a tooth. It has much more tooth than the other. And when you mark on it, you can mark heavily, you can mark lightly. I'll go using the side of the pastel. You get many, many more of these skips. So that lets you layer the pastel on and still see some of the colors underneath. And you can still blend and mix. There we've added our red orange over part of the blue and the yellow, or marigold. And you can see the more coats we put in, the fewer skips you get. And if you did some blending. So if you've got a bunch of illustration board around, it's really neat because unlike drawing paper, it's much thicker and it will be easier to work with when you mount it on a piece of board or something to do your pastels. My favorite, this is the professional version of the sandpaper that I recommend that beginners get. Sandpaper. It allows the pastel to go on and you can put many layers of pastel on here. You can blend it. You can do a lot of things with it. You can make over broad strokes and they show through. And you can press relatively hard and still have a lot of area left to receive more pastel over the top of it. So this is UArt sanded. I mounted it onto a piece of foam board, so that's why it's rigid. Sanded papers, they call them sanded, but don't let sanded make you think that you can take sandpaper and sand your drawing paper. When they say sanded, at first that's what I thought. But I've discovered that sanded papers basically are sandpaper that is for artists. And the difference between this and what you would get at your local hardware is the material that the sand is applied to is archival. And the sandpapers probably are not archival that you get from the hardware. But the price difference is huge. So until you are ready to paint something you want to frame, sandpaper from the hardware is just fine. Okay, mixed media paper. Mixed media paper is a thick paper. It's a paper that allows you to have enough thickness that later on, if you decide you want to do some wet pastel techniques. And when I say wet pastel techniques, we're talking about wetting whatever I draw on here with a brush, and it leaves and stains the paper and fills in some of those white holes. Those little white holes bug a lot of artists. Others, they love those white holes. And I'll show you some papers that actually give them a pattern. Later on when you learn to paint, you can know that you're going to get a pattern from them. So if I don't like those white holes, I can try to blend them in. And that's one way, but when you start learning to blend pastel, you'll find out that the colors dull a little bit. So some people don't like to blend. And so a way to get rid of those is to wet the paper with water or other materials after you put the basic drawing on, and then paint pastel over that, and those little skips will disappear. All right, moving on. I probably should have put this before the mixed media, but this is a watercolor paper. This is Canson watercolor paper. A lot of my pastel friends will use watercolor paper because it's meant to have water applied so it doesn't buckle, it doesn't warp. But as you can see, it has depending whether you get a cold press or a hot press, and I forgot to look to see what this was, but you can see you get a lot more skips. But at the same time, if we decide to wet that down, those skips will fill if you don't like the skips. If you like the skips, watercolor paper could be for you. There we go, and there's our blues. And just like the other paper, you can add a lot of pastel to this before it starts to fill up all those holes. So a lot of good mixing with watercolor paper. Our next paper is charcoal paper. Now the only difference between charcoal and pastel, well, there's a lot of differences, but charcoal paper has a set of lines in it that go vertical and horizontal, and so if you like to see those skips and see those lines, you can create some very nice effects. And there's a number of artists that later on, when we talk about art history and looking up artists, there's a number of artists that use this with charcoal very effectively. And again, you can blend in and you can have the skips. You can increase or decrease the amount of skips. So if you're looking for textures that show through, this charcoal paper is a great option for those artists too. All right, one last non-traditional surface. Cardboard. 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 Who uses cardboard? A lot of artists use cardboard. Matter of fact, in college, my first painting class was we covered cardboard and we painted right on it with house paint was what sealed it. So you don't need to seal this, but the more you seal it with a commercial gesso or something like that, the more archival it becomes, because cardboard is not archival. It will fall apart. However, when I was in Paris, I looked in the museum and there were actually paintings there from famous artists that were on cardboard. Now, if you don't want all these lines to show through, which is kind of neat sometimes when they do, if you don't want that corrugation to show through, can you see some of that, the corrugation? See that? It's a uniform skip and jump. If you don't like that corrugation, then you would want to use what some people call tag board or press board or chipboard. That's a cardboard material that is smooth and doesn't have the corrugation. Okay, now another technique to change all of these papers, you could put it on the cardboard, you could put it on the illustration board, is using what we pastelists call clear gesso. Now this is a milky, it looks like it's white paint, but when it dries nearly clear and you can see through it, but it has a little bit of a frosted surface. This has a grit in it, and when you paint it on, it will create more grit for any of these surfaces we just used. So that's another technique, but you have to get comfortable not wanting sharp edges if you use clear gesso to create a surface to paint on. You don't always want sharp edges, and so clear gesso is something that I use because I love blurry edges. Okay. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Hopefully you got something out of that. If you're liking what you see, then please, by all means, hit the like button, but better yet, hit the subscribe button and the notification button, and you'll be notified when I post the next videos. I post a link on my online for my Facebook and social media folks, so you can go there for Avon Waters on Facebook or Instagram, and you will see some of these posts with these links as they come up. But the best way is hit that subscribe button. So we all deserve to be happy. We all deserve great health, our great mental health. Art is relaxing. It's soothing. If you don't take yourself too serious and you just enjoy making something because your work day is stressful, you'll find art is a great way to relieve that stress, especially drawing techniques like we use in pastel. Those are great. So if you want to continue, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you on the next episode. Take care. Happy painting.